Welcome to this Wisel Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of our series on writing SQL for Excel files, we're going to look at how to use union queries to include total rows in your query output. So we'll start by using a union query to show detail rows and a single summary row, and then explain how to include multiple summary rows in the same query. We'll also explain how you can sort the query results so that the summary rows appear in a sensible place. And then we'll move on to looking at grouping rows and adding a grand total row to the grouped output. We'll explain how to include subtotals and build up to a fairly complex example that includes detail rows, subtotals and grand totals in the same query, neatly sorted and neatly formatted. So let's get started. If you've been following along with this series so far, you'll be fairly familiar with the basic setup by now, so feel free to skip to the next chapter of the video without missing anything important. If you haven't seen previous parts of the series, here's a quick overview of how things work. We have a macro-enabled workbook which allows us to run a query by clicking this button, and when we do that it's going to extract some information from a separate Excel file called Movies. The Movies workbook in this video has just a single worksheet called Film, and there's a list of 1200 films on that sheet. I'm going to keep this workbook open for the duration of the video, but feel free to close down the Movies workbook, all of the code will still work. I'll have both of those files stored in the same folder, and I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download these same two files and follow along with writing the code if you'd like to. The code in the Union Queries with Total Rows workbook relies heavily on Microsoft ActiveX data objects. That's not something I'm going to talk about much in this video. The focus of this series is on the SQL side of things. If you are interested in how ActiveX data objects works, we do have a separate series which covers that, and I'd recommend starting with this video, How do I get data from a closed Excel file using VBA? Just to show the basic process, if I head back to my Union Queries with Total Rows workbook, I can click the Run Query button, and that's going to trigger a subroutine which will construct an SQL statement. So here's the basic query we'll start with. It's selecting 3 columns from the film worksheet in the Movies workbook. That query then gets passed into a separate subroutine which deals with the complicated stuff, such as establishing the connection to the Movies workbook, extracting the data into a record set, and here's the point at which our SQL query gets used, and then all the data gets written out into a new worksheet. So if I just head back to the top of that subroutine, head back to the menu sheet, and click my Run Query button, I'll get a list of films from the Movies workbook. So now that I have my list of films, I'd like to write a separate query which will summarise that data using some of the basic aggregate functions. So I'd like to count the film titles, average the runtime, and sum the Oscar wins. I'll head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and the simplest thing to do here is just to copy and paste the original set of code which creates our SQL query. We'll leave the original one in place and then paste the new copy just below, and then we can comment out the original one just by typing an apostrophe at the beginning of the first line. I then want to wrap the count function around the title column. I can add an alias, although I'm going to delete that fairly shortly, but just to demonstrate and remind you of how to add aliases to columns, let's have an alias which says number of films or count of films, something along those lines. For the runtime, I'm going to go with the AVG runtime, and then we'll call that one as average runtime. And then finally we'll have the sum of Oscar wins, so we can wrap the sum function around that column and call that one total Oscars. Okay, so having done all of that, we can then head back to the menu sheet and run the query again, and this time we'll get a summarised row which shows you the total number of films, 1200, average runtime and total Oscars. Next, I'd like to combine these two separate sets of results so that I can see my summary row at the bottom of the list of film details. And to do that we can union these two queries together. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'll start by uncommenting the first SQL query. Then I'm going to remove the text which says SQL query equals and the continuation character from the second query. I don't want to reset the value of the SQL query. I'm going to union these two select statements together, and to do that I need to concatenate the second query to the first with a continuation character, and then rather than just saying select, we can say either union or union all select. The difference, if you remember from the previous video, is that union will remove duplicates, whereas union all will show all rows even if they are duplicates. It won't make any difference in this particular example because the total row will be different to all of the other rows in the first select statement, but there's a small potential performance advantage in not attempting to remove duplicates using union all. So having done that, we don't really need to bother with the aliases in the second query now. The column names will be derived from the first select statement in the union query. So these aliases will be ignored. They're completely redundant. So let's take them out just to clean up the code a little bit. So having done all that, we can then head back to the menu sheet and run the query again. And we'll find if we head down to the very bottom of the list, I'll hold down the Control key and tap the down arrow key, we get our total row sitting at the bottom with a count, average and sum. Now it looks a little odd to mix our aggregate functions on one single line. I think it would work better if we had a single row for the totals using the sum function, and maybe use the title column to label that row as total, and then a separate line to have the averages, and again use the title column to label that row as average. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to start by changing the first union query to show only the sum of the two columns, so sum of runtime and sum of Oscar wins. I'm then going to modify the count of title. I'll remove the count altogether in this case and just place a literal string in place of the title column or the count of the title column. Let's call this one total. Then we can happily copy and paste. In fact, let's copy and paste the continuation character from the previous line as well. Paste that in at the end. And then this time we'll change the column name to say, or sorry, the row label to say average. And then we'll change the sum functions to say AVG and AVG. Having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet and run that query again. And if we head down to the bottom of the list, it looks a little more sensible now. We've got one row for totals and one row for averages. Next, I'd like to add some criteria to my query so that I only see films that have won at least one Oscar. Now you need to be careful when you have union queries to add the where clause to each of the select statements involved. Let's just add it first of all to the main select statement, which populates the list of individual film details. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, we can insert a where clause after the from clause of the first select statement by saying where, and we'll refer to the Oscar wins column and ask to show only those films where the Oscar wins is greater than 0. I'll then concatenate a continuation character to make that valid. And then, if we head back to the menu sheet and we run that query, we'll see that we are indeed filtering this list now, so we don't see any non-Oscar winners in the list. But if we head all the way down to the bottom to the summary rows, you can see that those haven't changed. They're the same as on the previous worksheet where we were selecting all 1200 films. So we need to make sure that if we want the totals to work correctly, that we include the where clause in the select statements, which populate those totals and averages. That's nice and easy to do. We can head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we can copy and paste the where Oscar wins greater than 0, and then paste it in after each of the from clauses for the next two queries. I'll also just need to make sure that I change the position of the continuation characters at the end of the where clause on the last select statement. Make sure that those are placed back on the from clause on the previous line. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet and click the Run Query button again. And this time we'll see we filter the list of film details, but we've also filtered the aggregations at the bottom of the list, so we're only showing the totals and averages for those films which are indeed Oscar winners. It would also be nice to be able to sort our query results, but this is a little trickier than you might expect, because unlike a where clause, which can be added individually to each of the select statements in the union query, a union query only has one valid order by clause, and that appears right at the very end of the entire sequence of select statements, so we order by the final set of results. So let's say, for example, we try to sort by the film title to put the titles in ascending order. I could actually technically place an order by clause at the end of the first select statement. It's just that it would be completely ignored by the union query, much like the aliases that we deleted earlier on. So in order to do this correctly, I need to add my order by clause to the very end of the entire query. So let's add a new line, and we'll have an order by title, and we'll go in ascending order, or that will be the default anyway. So you can probably spot what the obvious problem is going to be here. The total and average row headers are also included in the title column. So these are going to be mixed in. If we head back to the menu sheet and run that query, we'll find that our average and total rows are mixed in alphabetically with all of the film titles. One fairly simple solution to this problem is to add an extra helper column to our query to allow us to sort the rows in the order we want. The basic idea would be to assign the same value to every single one of the films generated by the first select statement, and then assign a different value to the 2 rows generated by the second and third select statements. So to do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to assign my helper column, or my sort column, as the first column in the select statement. So I'm going to assign a new row. I'm going to assign the value of 1 to every single row in that select statement, and give it an alias. Let's call it something simple like sort col. I'll then concatenate my continuation character and make sure I've separated this column from the next by adding a comma to the beginning of the next line. I can then do the same thing in the other 2 union queries. Of course, I've got to make sure that every single select statement in the union query has the same number of columns in it. But I'll assign a number of 2 to the rows in this select statement. And then there's no point assigning an alias to that, of course, because it will be ignored as we saw earlier on. So I can then concatenate that with a continuation character and start the next line with a comma. And then I can just copy and paste that into the third and final select statement, and again make sure that I type in a comma at the beginning of the next line. Finally then, in the order by clause, I can choose to sort by that sort col. Now ordinarily in a select statement you can't use a column alias to perform your sorting, but in a union query you can use a column alias in the order by clause. I'll indicate that I want that in ascending order, although of course that's the default anyway. But once I've done that, I can head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, and I'll get the long list of results as I saw, but at the bottom of the list now I'll have my average and totals with the film names sorted alphabetically. The slightly annoying thing about this particular solution, of course, is that we end up with this extra column of essentially meaningless values, and ideally I wouldn't like to see those in the final output. Probably the most elegant solution to that would be to use a derived table subquery. The idea behind that would be that this entire select statement, and combination of union all select statements, is used to feed the from clause of an outer select statement which is wrapped around the entire thing. From there we can then just select the only columns we want to see in the output. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, which is focusing on union queries, but we will have examples of derived tables and other subqueries in several different videos later on in the series. For now, I think the simplest, most pragmatic approach is simply to delete the first column of our final query output. And we can do that in a couple of different places. I think just for simplicity, at the end of the create SQL query subroutine, I'm going to simply say active sheet dot columns 1 dot delete. So having done that, if I then head back to the menu sheet and I run that query again, we'll see we get the list of results sorted the way we want them, just with that extra column disappearing at the end. Next, I'd like to look at how to union a grouped query with a set of grand totals, and to do that we're going to group our films based on the genre to which they belong. So to start with that, I'll head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to comment out the entire combination of queries we've written so far by adding a single apostrophe to the beginning of the very first line. I can then just copy the first select statement all the way down to and including the where clause. And I'm going to paste that in just before we run the query by passing the string into the get query results procedure. I'm then going to change the title field to the genre field, just to remind you of the basics of adding a group by clause to a query. So we'll have our grouping field, which will be genre, and then we'll have the sum of runtime, which I'll provide an alias to. I'll call this one as total runtime. And then the same thing for the Oscar wins. Let's say sum, and then say as total Oscars. And then to group this query, we can concatenate a group by clause to the end. So I'll add a new line character or a continuation character, and then below that say group by, and then the genre field. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet, I'll just tidy things up a little bit first by deleting all but the menu sheet, and then click the Run Query button to get our grouped results based on the genre field. From this point, adding in the total rows is just as simple as it was in the previous example. So we can head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we can just copy and paste the union all select statements from the previous example, including the continuation character on the previous line, all the way down to and including the order by clause. So we can paste those in at the bottom. Of course, we don't want to sort in ascending order of film title now, as we don't include that in our list. So we're going to go for the genre column instead. So having done all that, we can head back to the menu sheet, run the query again, and we get our list of all the films grouped by genre, and then the grand average and grand total for all of the films in those lists. For the next set of examples, I'd like to try to combine all the things we've done so far to show a list of individual films with a subtotal for each genre and then a grand total right at the very end. And I'd like to build this up step by step, so I'm going to start by stripping things back to the basic list of films with the basic details. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to basically get rid of everything in the query that we've just written so far. So let's remove the entire thing, and then head back up to the original query that we've commented out. And again, I'm going to start by copying and pasting everything from the SQL query equals down to and including the first where clause. So I'll copy that and then just paste it in just down at the bottom. I'm going to add in an extra column just so that we can see the genres of each film. I'm going to add a new line. In fact, the simplest thing to do here is to copy and paste the title line into a new line either above or below, and then change the name of that column to genre from title. Having done that, we could then head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, and there's our basic list to begin working with. Next, I'd like to include the subtotals for each genre in the same set of results. So to do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and once again we're going to copy and paste. So from the query that we commented out earlier, from the end of the first where clause, I'm going to grab the continuation character, the union all select, all the way down to the second where clause. So we'll copy that and then paste that in at the end of our existing query. Then we need to make some changes. I have to map the same number of columns in the second select statement as in the first. So we've got our sort column there already with the number 2, that's fine as it is. For the second column, I'd like to display the name of the genre again. So I'm just going to copy and paste that from the first select list here and paste that in just below. So that will mean that in our output, the total row, the summary row, will contain the name of the genre. Then I need to decide what I want to display in the title column. Ideally, I don't want to display anything. The summary rows here generated by the group by clause shouldn't include the title at all. So the easiest way to get rid of those is just to display an empty string by removing the word total and placing an empty string in its place. I then need to include my group by clause, so I can concatenate another continuation character to the end of that last line and say group by genre. And then with that done, I can head back to the menu sheet, run that query again, and we'll get a set of results showing the individual films alongside their genres, and then at the end of this list, the genres with no film names and the total runtime and the total Oscar wins. Next, I'd like to deal with the sort order of the results. Ideally, I'd like to see the films in each genre listed together in a continuous section, with the total for that genre either just above or just below it. So to get that to work, we'll need to make some modifications to the sort column. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then at the beginning of the very first sort column, I'm going to concatenate the value of the genre field. So in some square brackets, I'll reference the genre field, and then concatenate that with the number 1 as a string. Then I'm going to do the same sort of thing in the second select statement, so I'm just going to do a bit of copy and pasting, and then make sure to close a single quote character after the number 2 there. So currently, the way we have this sorted, the subtotals will sit at the bottom of the list. If we wanted the subtotals to appear at the top, we could just reverse these 2 numbers. But of course that won't work unless we actually include the order by clause. So let's concatenate an order by clause to the end of the entire query, and we'll reference our sort col field, just like so, in either ascending or descending order. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, and we'll end up with the list of action films at the top with the action total just below it, then the adventure films and the adventure total, and so on. If we did prefer to have the subtotal sitting at the top of each list, then that's nice and easy to change now. Back in the Visual Basic Editor, we could just make sure that the value for the sort field for the total is less than that for the main list. So I can change the number 2 to the number 0, for example, head back to the menu sheet, and then we get our total rows sitting at the top of each section rather than below. It would also be nice to sort alphabetically by film title within each genre, and to do that we just need to include the value of the title field within our sort column definition. So if you head back to the Visual Basic Editor, the only place we need and should do this is in the first select statement, the one that actually selects the individual film titles. We don't want to include that in the group by query below, otherwise we then have to include the title column in the group by clause, which we definitely don't want to do. So in the first select statement, let's concatenate the title field just after the number 1. It might help to see what's going on here if we just comment out the line which deletes the additional helper column so we can see what we've generated. If we then head back to the menu sheet and then run the query again, we'll see this is the value we're actually sorting by. So it's going to be the value of the genre name, followed by either the number 0 or the number 1, and then the name of the film. So sorting in this order means that we get a nice set of results sitting out in the main list when we delete that first column. Next, we could make some changes to improve the appearance of our final output. So of course we can delete the sort column again, there's no need to see that. It also seems a little silly to include the name of the genre next to each film when we have this header row or footer row depending on where we position it. So we'll hide the genre name in the film detail rows. We could also make the total row stand out a little more by capitalizing the text for the genre name and maybe adding the word total to the end. So to do all of that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we'll start by just deleting the first column again, so we'll uncomment that line. To get rid of the genre name next to each film name, we could just replace the genre field there with the single quote characters, so an empty string. But bear in mind that if we do that, that column will no longer have any name in the first select statement, which will affect the rest of the query as well. Let me just show you what I mean by that. If I try to type in 2 single quote characters there, that's removed the genre column and replaced it with an expression column basically, so it has no name. If we head back to the menu sheet and attempt to run that, it means that that column now is called expression 1001. So let's add in an alias to that column so that it's still called genre, and that will make the rest of the results look a little neater. And then we can make some modifications to the genre name in the second select statement. So I wanted to capitalize the text first of all. We could say uCase and wrap the genre column in a uCase function. And then we could concatenate the word total to the end of the genre name to make it really stand out. So having done that, we could head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, and things look a little easier to read, I think, at this point. Now it is perhaps a little wasteful to have an extra column just to hold the titles for the subtotal rows, so let's merge the genre and the title columns into one. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, the simplest way to do that is just to remove the column definitions which produce these empty strings. So I'm going to get rid of the genre column from the first select statement, and then what was mapped to the title column in the second select statement. So let's get rid of those 2 lines, and then if we head back to the menu sheet, we can run that query again, and everything is now merged into one single column with the same sort order applied, of course. That's not perhaps the easiest to read, even though we've capitalized the subtotal titles. So maybe we could indent the film names by a tab space or a number of spaces inside each cell. If we head back to the menu, the Visual Basic Editor, I should say, if we wanted to indent the film titles, one way to do that would be to concatenate a tab space. Now there isn't a way you can directly type a tab space in to your text, but what we could do is concatenate a character code which generates a tab space. So there's a function that you can use in your SQL for Excel files queries called CHR, short for character. And the idea here is that you can enter the ASCII code character that would generate a particular character on screen. So I happen to know that the number for the tab character is character number 9. I could then concatenate that with the title, but this doesn't quite have the desired effect, unfortunately. If I head back to the menu sheet and I run that query, there's apparently no difference in the end results whatsoever. Now the tab space has actually been inserted into the cell, it's just not being displayed. If, for example, I selected a cell containing a film name and you look in the formula bar, you can clearly see that there's a tab space character stored in there. It's just not displayed, and in fact it pops up when I select the cell and double click into it. The tab space is there as well. The annoying thing is it doesn't get displayed in the results, and the whole point of doing this was to improve the appearance. So rather than concatenating a tab space, we could insert a number of physical spaces. So if we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, rather than concatenating the results of the character function, we could type in a number of spaces manually, stored inside a set of single quotes. Or rather than doing that, there is a function that allows you to insert a number of space characters. It has a cunning name of space. So I'm going to type in the space function and in some round brackets, type in the number 8 to insert 8 space characters in front of the film title. Now, of course, you may have noticed because that's now an expression column, it doesn't technically have a name any longer. It's called expression 1001. So we should rename this column by assigning an alias to it. Let's call it as title again. So as title. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet again and run that query one more time. And now things are a little easier to read yet again. Finally, I'd just like to include a row that shows the grand total for the entire list. We can place that either at the very top or at the very end of the current list. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to start by copying and pasting the union all select statement up to and including the where clause and the continuation character at the end. So once I've copied that, I'm going to paste it in between the group by and the order by clause. And then I want to think about what values I want to display on each line. So I want to make sure that I don't show the genre name. I want this to say grand total. So let's modify that part first. That's nice and easy to do. And then I also need to consider what value I should enter for the sort column. If I want the grand total to sit at the very top of the list, I just need to make sure that alphabetically, whatever value I put here would appear above the genres concatenated with the number 0 and the genres concatenated with the number 1. So a fairly safe bet is if you add the value 0 there, that will sit at the very top of the list. To do the reverse of that, if I wanted it sitting at the very bottom of the list, just make sure that alphabetically whatever value you put would sit below the list of sorted genres. So again, a fairly safe bet would be just the letter Z or multiple Zs if you expect a genre starting with the letter Z. It's not a particularly elegant solution, but it works. I'd like to place my grand total at the very top of the list, so I'm going to enter the number 0 or the text 0. And then just to tidy things up a little bit more again, I'm going to make sure I've got some extra indenting for the genre row titles. So I'm going to copy and paste the space 8 function and then increase the indenting for the individual film titles up to 16 spaces. A little excessive, but the end result looks quite nice. So having done all that, we can head back to the menu sheet and run that query one more time. And we'll see we get a fairly nicely presented list of grand totals, individual genre totals and individual film details. So there we go, those are a few techniques you can use to combine details, subtotals and grand totals in a single query. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching as always. See you next time.